Sound tall? Oh, there we go. Now I sound tall. If you have your Bibles, go to John chapter 1, if you will, and we'll spend a little bit of time in John and then maybe move over just a little bit. My brother, when he was in college, he attended Faulkner University when it was Alabama Christian College, and just off campus there was a very successful church, and there was a couple of guys there on their ministry staff, and my brother was bagging groceries at Food World. And that's when groceries came in paper sacks, for those of you who are young, and people put them in the bags for you and carried them out to your car. But he was making money at Food World, but he asked the guys at this church if he could just audit their ministry. He said, I'll come over and do anything you want me to do if I can hang out with your ministers and learn some things about ministry. And he did that, and I thought that was a pretty interesting idea. So I started, even as a young man, doing some apprenticeships. I would call somebody in town who was doing something and say, hey, I'll give you a day or a week of my life if I can come figure out how you do what you do for a living. So I spent some time in a cabinet shop, spent some time with some tree surgeons. I spent a week with a group that builds ropes courses, ended up being a ropes course builder, at least have the skills and qualities to do that, and just learn to do things. I get this reputation that I'm somehow a law enforcement guy. I'm a chaplain. I'm not a shooter. I'm not an operator. I don't have a badge. You know, I couldn't arrest your dog. But I've been hanging out with a SWAT team for about 30 years, even auditing what they do. You know, I get to make entries and clear buildings and shoot on the range and play with all the toys. And so I learned a long time ago that if I could spend time with somebody who's an expert in a field, that would help me grow way faster than me trying to learn this thing and make mistakes on my own. So if we could model what we do in our relationships after an expert, that'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Now, suppose that you could describe a relationship and the relationship was absolutely incompatible. Okay? I don't know how you would describe that, but, you know, talk about polar opposites. If you could find somebody who could fix a relationship like that, and you could mimic or model their technique or their tool, if they could take a relationship where they were absolutely incompatible and fix that, that would probably be the master plan for relationships. And so as I started thinking about relationships and I started thinking about, you know, who would be the best model, and I read the stuff by Willard Harley and read all the stuff by John Gottman and looked at the stuff that Michelle Davis does, even look at the LaHaye book. I use a book called Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's a SYMBIS series. That's what SYMBIS stands for, Saving Your Marriage Before. I looked at all those things, and all of them had some validity. All those, you know, very well researched, very well written. And then I was doing some different kind of study, and I had this light bulb moment, had this epiphany. And I think probably one of the most theologically significant verses in the Bible is John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. See, when John starts writing his gospel, he's writing a different kind of gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about the life of the Messiah from three different perspectives. Matthew's going to prove that the Messiah is a descendant from David, and he's the Jewish guy. Mark is going to appeal to a Roman mindset. He's going to focus on Jesus' power. He's going to talk about Jesus' pace. He's going to be very succinct in his writing so that a Roman who read it, a non-Jewish person, would look at that and think, man, this Jesus guy is powerful. Luke is going to appeal to somebody who's Greek. Luke is going to mention more women and more outsiders from the Jewish faith than anybody else. And then you get to John, and John, you know, doesn't start with the birth of Jesus. He starts with the pre-existence of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word there, Logos, was this Greek idea, this intellectual reasoning of the universe. You know, John said that in the Greek mindset, if you knew what the Logos was, then you understood the impetus or the catalyst for all intellectual knowledge in the universe. And John gave it a name, gave it a face. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so John's talking about the incarnation of the divine eternal Spirit into the human flesh. Now, I'm not sure that I can properly explain the triune God. I'm not sure I can wrap my mind around the Trinity. When you read this passage in Greek, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. You've got a Greek construction that uses the name of God, and it's almost like we use a capital letter. And so he's talking about God. And then when he says, and the Word was God, that Greek construction is not there, and it's almost like he's not using the personal name of God, but using a descriptor. That's the difference I'm from Alabama, and sometimes we name our children strange things. I know my grandmother called my grandfather Buck. His name was Buster, but my grandmother called him Buck. Now, if you put a capital letter on Buck, that's a name. If you put a small letter on Buck, that's a deer. Okay, so that's what John's doing. He says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, capital G, and then the Word was God, but it's not a personal name, it's a description. And we've struggled with how to translate that. You can't say in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, because there's only one. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was deity. That probably works. It doesn't speak to me like maybe it does and don't have a good handle for understanding. In my mind, it's in the beginning was the Word was with God, personal name for God, and then the Word was, and just for my own convention, and the Word was God stuff. The Word was the same substance as God. Now, this is not a flawless illustration, but it's the best I can do, okay? I'm Oxford educated, but it's Oxford, Alabama, so you'll have to kind of bear with that. But if I take a glass of water and put it right here on the podium, what's the chemical formula for water? AH2O. If I take that water and I lower the temperature to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius, it becomes a hydroxide we call God put on a tent, one of these things, that would get tired, and it would get hungry, and it would get thirsty, and it would get anxious, and it could bleed when it got beaten, and it was saddened when other tents died, and it was betrayed, and it was crucified. And his godlikeness, or his God form, left that part of his existence and came and walked around in one of these things. And because he walked around in one of these things, it gave him a unique perspective. When I teach crisis intervention to the cops, one of the things that we're doing now in Huntsville is we're trying to train our police officers to respond to people in a mental health crisis without using the normal things that we teach cops to do. The young cadets that are in the academy right now are trained in 3 modalities: ask, tell, make. I show up, I ask you to do something, and if you don't, I tell you to do something. If you don't, I make you do something. That's what we train these young guys for. If you've got a person who is in your home and they go into a mental health crisis, or when somebody goes into a mental health crisis and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't call your therapist. Number 1, we don't get out of bed. Number 2, we're expensive. But if you get somebody in your home and they've got a mental health crisis, it doesn't cost you anything to dial 911. And when you dial 911, they have 3 options. They can send you the kid who's a fireman, they can send you the kid who's a paramedic, or they can send a young person with a badge and a gun. And the badge and the gun shows up and there's already implied force. If you didn't need to use force, the fireman can handle it. If you didn't need to use force, the guy who drives the boo-boo bus can handle it. But you're scared, and you don't know what this person who's in this crisis. So we're going to send a young person who has a plate carrier and a force continuum on his belt. Well, when you call a person to do that, they do what they're trained to do. That's interesting. If you call an exterminator to your house, he will kill the animals there, not remove them. There's a lady who lives behind me in the pasture. She caught me out jogging one day. She said, "Aren't you the guy that lives across the pasture behind my house?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Do you hear the coyotes at night?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I hear the coyotes at night." She said, "I think they bother my horses." I said, "If you'll give me permission to come to your pasture, I can solve that problem for you." She said, will you relocate them? I said, yes, ma'am, to coyote heaven. Oh, we can't have that. Well, I only know one, I only have one skill set when it comes to coyotes. I don't lure them away. I don't make them friends. I don't trap them. I send them to another plane of existence. So when these young cops show up, they've been trained with ask, tell, make. And we're trying to teach them if you roll into a scene, and they didn't get trained to be sent to those scenes, but they're going to get sent to those scenes. And so when you roll up, you start asking yourself a question. Is there a danger? Am I in danger? Is anybody else in danger? And if not, I can ignore the tool belt and start trying to talk to these people about what's going on. And once you can talk to a person, and most of the interactions we have, and even the interactions the cops have, it looks like this. And you'll see me do goofy hand motions. Okay? And typically it's, I'm telling you this, I'm telling you this, I'm telling you this, I'm telling you this. It often boils down to, even our relationships, I'm yelling at you from one perspective. You must understand what I'm saying. No, 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 you must understand what I'm saying. No, 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 you must understand what I'm saying. And at any point that it turns into, hey, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. As soon as you make that switch, as soon as you can see the world from their perspective, you get a yes. You walk into a place and a guy is having a schizophrenic episode. He's had a break with reality, and he's standing in the middle of Walmart and he's throwing canned foods at a dragon. Sir, what's going on? I'm throwing canned foods at a dragon. Well, there's not a dragon there. That doesn't help anybody out. Sir, I can't see the dragon, but I bet if you saw the dragon, it scares you to death. Yes, sir, I'm frightened. You see what just happened? That connection. The idea that I can relate to what you're seeing. I got asked to do a conflict resolution seminar for some crane operators. Now, I've been around some rough men in my life. I've spent 31 years embedded and working and responding and riding on the big black armored truck with a SWAT team. I've seen some dudes with rough edges. The crane dudes are in a world by themselves. The guys who operate cranes did not go to Miss Emily's finishing school for fine young ladies of politeness. That is a rough crowd. This big crane company in Nashville bought a little crane company in Decatur, and they were fighting like cats and dogs. And so they asked me to come up there and solve that thing. I wasn't sure if I was going to go up there and have to whip a bunch of people, but they all met at this restaurant. And this group sat on this side of the table, and this group sat on that side of the table, and you could feel the tension in the room. Well, I took a bunch of sheets of paper, and I wrote the number 6 on it. And I put it on the table between everybody. I said, add 3 to your number and defend your answer. And chaos ensued. Because the guys sitting on the right side of the table, their answer was 9. The guys on this side of the table, their answer was 12. Because depending on which side of the table you're sitting on, that looks like a 6 or it looks like a 9. I didn't tell them what it was. I just let them fight about it. And then I finally, before I thought they were going to start using silverware on each other, said, hey, everybody swap sides of the table. And the guys who saw the 6 saw a 9. The guys who saw a 9 saw a 6. One guy even said, well, I know he thinks it's a 9, and I can see how he'd come up with that stupid answer, but I still believe it's a 6. He had a little more work to do, but at least he admitted, I can see this from your perspective. And when God went camping, He put on our tent and experienced our experiences. God attuned to our experience. If you want to, look at this great description in Hebrews chapter 4. The Hebrew writer's talking to his audience, and he's trying to convince them, don't leave Christianity and go back into Judaism. And there's multiple reasons why you shouldn't leave Christianity and go back into Judaism. The most obvious one in the first century world is that Judaism was broken. Everything you read in the New Testament about what the Jews were doing religiously was a broken, failed system. See, when you read the New Testament, you don't have any covenant, law of Moses, authority for the Sanhedrin court. You don't have any law of Moses authority for a synagogue system. That stuff they're just making up. When you read the New Testament, what you hear mostly in the New Testament about Jewish religious holidays is Passover, 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 Passover. The big event in Jewish holidays was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. There's 3 veiled references to Day of Atonement in the New Testament. John the Baptizer will look at Jesus and say, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." Peter will refer to Jesus as the propitiation, or the hilasteron, the mercy seat cover on the ark is what he actually calls Jesus. And that's significant in Jewish theology, because if you went to Herod's temple, and that temple had been standing there since Ezra's temple had been expanded upon. And so if you got the Jewish people together and you went through the Yom Kippur ritual and you had the sacrifice and the priest was in his vestments, and only one time a year could he enter into the Holy of Holies. He walks into that massive temple, and there's this big curtain there that separates the holy place from the most holy place. And that curtain was as thick as a man's hand. Now, when it says as thick as a man's hand, it doesn't mean from palm to knuckles. It means from little finger to thumb. A curtain that thick, and he's got this laver, he's got this blood that he's going to sprinkle on the mercy seat. And you open up the curtain, and the priest steps back there. That room was empty. They hadn't had an Ark of the Covenant in 600 years. They couldn't do Day of Atonement. They didn't have a mercy seat. And what they were doing was just faking it till the Messiah came. And when the Messiah came, he became the mercy seat. He is the mercy seat. Peter calls him propitiation, calls him the hilasteron, calls him the top of the Ark of the Covenant where God dwells, and you sprinkle the blood on it. And so the Hebrew writers say, look, you can't leave. First of all, it's a failed system, and you've been making stuff up for 600 years. And now you're going to leave the priest, you're going to leave the sacrifice, you're going to leave the message of the Messiah and go back to that? It didn't work, and it doesn't work, and it can't work because you broke it. And so he's begging them not to abandon their Christianity and go back. And then he does this special thing about the priesthood of Jesus. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Hey, don't give this thing up. Don't quit. Don't turn back. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. He says, you want to leave and go back to the priestly system? Well, the priests in the Old Testament didn't inherit land. The priests in the Old Testament didn't have to raise sheep. The priests in the Old Testament didn't have to farm. They lived in the complex in and around Shiloh where the tabernacle was until the temple was built. And they didn't really know how the regular people lived. They didn't know what it was like to give up their best sheep because everybody brought their best sheep to them. They didn't have to worry about what it was to live off the land because all the produce of the land, a tenth of everything, came to the temple. So when somebody said, hey, you don't understand how much this cost me, a priest would go, yeah, I don't understand how much it costs you because I don't have to pay that. I'm a priest. We, in the New Testament, have a high priest who can sympathize to our weaknesses. And he was tempted in every way that you and I can be tempted. That's attunement. God says, your ways are not my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. I'm holy, you're not. And all of a sudden, God fixed our relationship. And how did God fix it? By attuning with us. By living our experience. By walking around in one of these tents. And he was hungry and he was tired and he got anxious. Anxious to the point where he says, I am anxious to the point even unto death. And he's lying in a garden on his face and his sweat is coming out of his forehead like great drops of blood, or either his capillaries actually burst and he's sweating blood, and he prays a prayer 3 times in desperation, and God says no to his prayer. You ever felt like God said no to your prayer? Well, Jesus said, if it's possible, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. So when you're despondent, when you're in despair, when you cry out in agony and you feel like there's no help, there's no hope, and there's no value, the God that walked around in a tent like yours understands that feeling. my God, why have you forsaken me? God knows what that feels like because He said it. And so when you have any experience in Christianity, when you have any experience as a human being, the God who wore a tent and lived like you do, so we don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses, but in all points was tempted just like we are. Now, if that's how God fixed His relationship with people, what would happen if I tried to do that with my wife? What would happen if I tried to do that with my kids? What would happen if you tried to do that with your parents? What would that look like if I tried to do it with you and I could see the world from your perspective? Now, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to think it's reasonable. I don't have to think it's rational. But if I could just demonstrate to you that I understand your needs. I understand your wants. I understand your likes. I understand your vulnerabilities. I understand your fears. I understand your insecurities. But so many times we live in a world and we assume that everybody sees the world like we see the world. I like to draw. I'm a decent cartoonist. I've got some t-shirt designs on a website, and I've illustrated a couple of kids' books. I did kind of a graphic novel. It's a parable about being selfish. And I drew all that stuff. Well, as a little kid, people would come to my house to play on Saturday. And we would go outside and play cowboys and Indians, and we would swing on the swing set, and we would chase critters, and then it would kind of get too hot, and we'd go inside, and they would say, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Let's draw." And my friends would go, "We don't draw." "What do you mean you don't draw?" "Well, everybody doesn't draw. And by the way, if you're good at math, you think everybody else is good at math." No, everybody's not good at math, okay? People who can draw aren't good at math. People who can do math can't draw. People who can draw and are good at math are called architects, okay? But anyway, but I had this perspective. Well, we view the world and we think everybody's insecure about that. Everybody likes that. Everybody doesn't like that. And when we start communicating with each other, we go from, I can draw, I'm good at math, to, oh, not everybody draws, not everybody's good at math. And now what do we do because of that? And that's what God did to fix His relationship with us. He became flesh and dwelt among us. We have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses because He was in all points tempted just like we are. And that's what we call attunement. Now, if you're a note taker and you want a little memory crutch, take the word attune, A-T-T-U-N-E, and this is what you use when you deal with somebody. If I come into the house and Miss Jones, my lovely wife, is torqued up to about 400 foot-pounds, the first thing I've got to do is the A in attune. I've got to acknowledge her emotions. Now, sometimes because we're not comfortable with other people's emotions or we think they're irrational or whatever, we tend to be emotion dismissing, we tend to be emotion denying, or we tend to be emotion disapproving. We do that with our kids all the time. Our kids grow up being told, you can't trust your emotions, you don't really feel that and you shouldn't feel that. Is it a wonder when they get a little older they're neurotic and they can't express their emotions, they don't understand their emotions. Well, understanding that my emotions are information rather than instruction, that my emotions are healthy, and that my emotions came from God, I can acknowledge, hey, you're mad, you're sad, you're happy, you're angry, you're disappointed. Mark Goldston, in his book, Just Listen, and that is the manual for FBI hostage negotiation. In his book, Just Listen, Mark Goldston talks about the empathy bomb. And the empathy bomb is basically you see somebody in an emotional crisis and you walk up and you say, I bet you think nobody else understands how disappointed you are. I bet you think nobody understands how bored you are. I bet you think nobody understands how stressed you are. And when you use the right word, you'll see their body change, their countenance will change, and they'll go, yeah, you're right, I am mad, sad, angry, depressed. And they'll talk to you for hours. And that's what you let them do, is let them talk. It's not the time to give wisdom. It's not the time to give adultisms. It's not the time to tell them how they should. You just let them talk. And as soon as, I bet you think nobody else understands how scared you are. You're right. That's attunement. That's acknowledging what your emotions are and that your emotions are okay and you can have them. Now, as long as your emotions don't tell you what to do, but they just tell you something. So attunement starts with, hey, I get that you're having emotions. And I can label those emotions and tell you those emotions are okay to have. That's A stands for acknowledge the emotion. The T stands for turn toward that. So many times as men, when our wives get into emotional crisis, we go into avoidant behavior. We like to hide. I come in and we had a teenage daughter. How many children did you have? I had about 5. But they were all in this one little package because you never knew which personality was going to come out. And so she comes in from school and she's ranting and raving about something. I think I'll go outside and change the oil in everything I own, okay? And just avoid the thing. No. When somebody's in an emotional crisis, instead of avoiding that, you turn toward it. And you let them know, hey, your strong emotions are not a reason for you to be ashamed and not a reason for me to run away. And sometimes just having a place to have emotions is a safe place. And so I acknowledge your emotions. You're mad, sad, happy, glad, despondent, depressed, whatever. And then instead of avoiding that, instead of pushing you away because you're different, I turn toward that. And oftentimes when people are emotional, John Gottman talks about bidding for affection. And when somebody offers you a bid for affection, you can turn toward, you can turn away, or you can turn against. And acknowledging somebody's emotions and turning toward them invites them to share, invites them to be open, invites them to be honest, invites them to be vulnerable. And we're not fixing anything, we're just sharing. I can't fill the void in grief, but I can sit with you and the void feels smaller. As a police chaplain, it's the weirdest thing I've ever done. Because if you're a local minister, every place you show up, you're in charge. You're in charge of the wedding, you're in charge of the funeral, you're in charge of the baptism. As a police chaplain, you show up, you're not in charge of anything. You don't have a badge, you don't have a gun. You watch chaos unfold. But over the last 31 years, I found out how important it is just to simply be there. One of my first chiefs said, hey, Lonnie, I'm going to give you a pager. And when it goes off, I want you to show up wherever SWAT's at. And for the last 31 years, I've been doing that. And I'm not a shooter, I'm not an operator, I'm not a tough guy. But when those guys get shot, or when those guys has to shoot somebody, and they've got a guy standing there that's not a cop that just cares, it's powerful. I mean, it's super powerful. I don't know how many times I've just stood around, and guys walk by and just touch you. Guys walk by and just put your arm around them. It's amazing. And so I turn towards you. I don't avoid you when you're in an emotional crisis. The second T in attunement is I acknowledge your emotions, I turn towards you, and I tolerate a viewpoint that I don't share. I don't have to argue with you about what you should feel or what you shouldn't feel. I just acknowledge the fact that you feel it. You need to be heard. I'm listening to you. You need to be understood. You're afraid, you're scared, you're disappointed, you're mad, and you need to be accepted. If I saw it the way you saw it, I'd probably feel that way too. Now, I don't see it that way, but if I saw it that way, I could see that. And so we tolerate a view that's different than ours. And that doesn't mean you're dropping into somebody's delusion. My wife is an extremely intelligent woman. She taught biology in school and science in school for about 25 years. She has a master's degree in kinesiology. But if she sees a mouse, all her intellectual knowledge goes out the door. She becomes a highly emotional creature, and she'll say, Jonesy, there's a rat. Rat, mouse, rat, different animal, but we've got a mouse in our house, and suddenly it's become a rat. It might as well be a heffalump or a woozle because she's in an emotional state. And what do? Shoot it. Well, that's bad on the hardwoods, honey. Let me get a broom, okay? But now, honey, that's a mouse, not a rat. A rat has and a mouse. That does no good to her at that moment of crisis. You're afraid, you're terrified, I'll deal with the mouse. And I usually call it a rat anyway. And because I tolerate a viewpoint, I'm not scared of mice. I'm not scared of spiders. I'm not scared of snakes. But debating with her that they're not dangerous doesn't do her any good as long as I tolerate the fact, hey, she's afraid of it. Now, if we respond to, I'm not afraid of it and you shouldn't be, oh, that's terrible. You're afraid of it. I'm not, I'll deal with it because you're afraid of it. You see how that works? So I acknowledge your fear. I turn towards your fear. I tolerate something that's opposite of mine. And then I try to deal, I try to deal with you with understanding. So let me get this straight. You think the little fuzzy thing on the floor is trying to eat you. He's looking for stuff we dropped on the floor. He's into the dog food bin. That's the only reason he came in. It's 4 degrees outside. It's not 4 degrees in here. He's looking for a warm place. He didn't come in here to eat you, honey. You realize they don't chase people. Oh, that snake's hiding to bite me. That snake's hiding from you. And if he bit you, he wastes his venom because he can't swallow you. Now, if you get a snake big enough to swallow, then I'll panic. But they just don't eat people a lot, okay? But I'm just going to let her know, hey, look, I understand that you're afraid. Not you shouldn't be afraid, not you should be afraid, not as I understand. You're scared, you're despondent, you're insecure, you're afraid, you're sad. And as soon as I start talking to you in a way that's not about how I think you should feel, but this is how I know you feel. Acknowledge it, turn toward it, tolerate it, understand it. The N is non-judgmental listening. Well, it's just ridiculous that you're afraid of a little mouse. To me, it is ridiculous. But based on what she grew up thinking and feeling and her experience with mine, that's a little different deal. I really think it's because they have no fur on their tails. And because they have no fur on their tails, it wiggles, it makes her think of a snake. And as a psychologist, I probably shouldn't analyze my wife, but I think it's a similar same trauma thing, okay? I'm a little uncomfortable around dogs. I got attacked by a Doberman pinscher my first summer as a youth minister. Took a bunch of kids door knocking, and this little kid got pinned up against a retaining wall by this Doberman. I walked between the kid and the Doberman didn't like it, and she attacked my right leg. I had one of those little zip-up King James Bible, put the word on her, pa-pa, and she repented. But now what my brain does is every time I see a dog, whether it's a Jack Russell or a canine, my brain says, hey, I know how that worked out last time. I don't like it, because your brain takes things that are similar and treats them as the same. Well, if you hadn't had my experience with dogs, you can't tell me not to be. And by the way, I'm 5'4". Most big dogs look me right in the eye. I'm snack size. Imagine what happened when the cop said, hey, Lonnie, for this exercise tonight, we're going to see if you can sneak out of our perimeter, and if you get loose, we're going to sick the canine on you. It was hard to say yes to that because of my past history. And if you've never been chased by a fur missile or a land shark, that's an interesting thing when a 120-pound dog chases you. You can't outrun him. It doesn't happen. Those movies where they outrun the dog, you don't outrun a dog. And that dog will find you. But when I see that dog, I think about that dog. And it takes some real changing of my mindset to go, that dog and that dog aren't the same. But if you saw the way I used to behave around dogs, you'd be judgmental of me. But you didn't have my experience with a black Doberman pinscher in the summer of 1980. So I listen to you, and I understand you, and I listen to you, and I'm not judgmental. Not this is what you should have done, this is not what you could have done. Hey, tell me what you did. And I will explore whether or not it worked or not, because A-T-T-U-N-E, the E stands for empathy. Oh. So this frightens you because of. This scares you because of. You feel worthless because of. Now, sometimes you're in a situation and you're experiencing these emotions and nothing can be done about it. Sometimes you just have to give people empathy. I recognize you're in a situation and you're hurt and it can't be fixed. I give you that empathy. And in some cases, it's not just empathy, but it's empowerment. Hey, what can we do to help you? And I think I heard the bell, so I'm going to not explore empathy very much or empowerment very much. I'm going to finish this verse. Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help us in the time of need. It's interesting that if Jesus wanted to be judgmental and Jesus wanted to be condemning, remember John 3:17 says He did not come into the world to condemn the world. Jesus is in a perfect place to condemn the world. Hey, I lived here 33 years, didn't make a mistake. Get your act together. We often expect people to be able to handle stuff like we handle stuff because we handle stuff. Jesus says, I was tempted in all points like as you were, and I didn't sin. So when you do sin, you feel free to come to me for grace and mercy and help in the time of need. Jesus doesn't say, I did it, why can't you? Jesus says, I did it, you don't have to. My wife doesn't have to be not scared of mice, because I'm not. My wife doesn't have to be not scared of snakes, because I'm not. I don't have to know some things about life, because my wife does. And all of a sudden, this idea that I'm better than you, no, we're a perfect match in our relationship, because in the things that she can't do, I can. Things I can't do, she can. But instead of judging each other, we compliment each other. And Jesus says, look, I was perfect. And instead of him saying, I'm perfect, why can't you be? He says, I was perfect, you don't have to be. I just want you to be faithful. And when we're inconsistent and when we're flawed, and I've got a little podcast I do called Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. And I just did an episode called Fake or Flawed. And it's okay to be inconsistent, and inconsistent doesn't mean hypocritical. I'm the perfect priest because I know what it's like to be you, and I didn't make your mistakes, and you don't have to. Have you ever seen Escape to Witch Mountain? Or Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Yeah, okay, there's a rock formation in that called the Devil's Tower. And Disney puts it in all their movies, I don't know why. But the Devil's Tower is an extinct volcano. It has a magma column that went up, the lava hardened, and then the dirt eroded from it. And it's this massive granite column that stands out in Wyoming. And if you climb it, you can put your name in a book on the top of it. And my name is in the book at the top of Devil's Tower. And I've never seen it. I've never been to it. A guy that I taught to climb was out west, saw the thing, camped out for 3 days waiting on the weather to clear, and he climbed the thing. And he got it to the top. And instead of putting his name in the book, he put my name in the book. And for history, if you get to the top of Devil's Tower and you go, well, who's been up here? It looks like I've been up there. And I've never even seen the thing. Troy Farmer, my dear friend and climbing partner, climbed it. And I don't have to. I don't even have a desire to, because my name's already in the book. God put on a tent and camped like you camped. And he says, you know, I'm perfect. You don't have to be. He's already put your name in a book. And you don't have to put your name in the book, because he put your name in the book. And that's because he understands our weaknesses and gives us grace and mercy in our time of need. So when your kids go into crisis, don't expect them to be adults. Give them grace and mercy in their time of need. When your parents are unreasonable, don't expect them to be perfect. Give them grace and mercy in their time of need. When your spouse is imperfect, don't expect them to be perfect. Give them grace and mercy in their time of need. When your church members are imperfect, don't demand that they be perfect. Give them grace and mercy in their time of need. Because attunement is understanding another person's weaknesses and making accommodations for it. Not because of what they owe us, but because of what we owe them. And that's the attitude of love. Thank you for studying with me, and God bless you. Brother, how are you this morning?
Doing good.